Today, I want to go over some recent tournaments that happened and talk about what's developed in the meta. And the main thing that I think we're getting into recently is the endgame meta of Splatoon 3.
We're in the endgame now.
But what does that even mean, and what happens from there is something I really want to talk about. So be sure to subscribe if you enjoy, and let's get started. First, let's talk about what's been happening recently in the game. The phase of restriction tournaments kind of died down. There was interest in it a little bit for Kraken Cheese, which got patched out of the game, and limiting Zuka, which hasn't been as much of an issue yet because Zuka usage rate has dropped off a lot, something we'll get into later, which means there's only one restriction left on the table that people are still considering. Something to do with Pencil. Either banning it entirely or removing charge up on the weapon has been considered because it's been completely dominating both support and cooler. I run a poll every now and then to gauge top player opinions on maps and a few other things, and threw in quite a few restriction questions. But while there was some interest in these, there was a relatively low interest in banning anything. So I don't think we're going to see more tournaments like this entering the mainstream. One thing that I think is also clear is that weapons that are seen as pretty good, but not quite at the top, are more than capable of winning tournaments. The most recent example is CDS winning an Area Cup. This was picked with a composition of Red Pencil, and Zap, and Slosher. Nothing too surprising there, but we actually haven't had a Dually Squelcher win a tournament in quite a long time. Not only that, but the player using it consistently decided to go with the custom Dually Squelcher, actually never picking the other one a single time. I think this makes a good bit of sense. Even though Splat Bomb is obviously going to be better for it than the Beacon, Chumps are quite underrated in zones right now in my opinion. They put out a ridiculous amount of paint and are very quick to use, which I think is especially helpful in this mode. Another prominent example was Junior winning a separate Area Cup. Another weapon that people think is already pretty good, just not at the very top of things, clearly being able to work in the hands of a good player. And while they didn't win Low Tide City, Moonlight featured a 96 Scal that was able to get second place with a set off of Starburst. And in a more recent Area Cup, another 96 was also able to get second. But I'll talk more about that entire comp later. It's good to see that regardless of meta shifts or restrictions, high tier weapons are still more than capable of winning events in the hands of players who are pushing them properly. Which I know I've talked about in other meta videos, it's just good to see it continue to happen with something that's been around for like a year now. In addition to that, a new season has come out, which has led to a few new weapons that people have been considering for competitive play. From stuff like the Crab Edit Splatling, the Decapitators, which saw use in early weeklies from players like Omega, CRB, and other good options like Bamboozler Mark II, or the new Dowser Dually having a very strong kit, which has led to more experimentation than usual, and probably will even more now that it's gotten some buffs. So with the stage set of a focus on a meta without restrictions, and high tier weapons doing pretty well from one tricks using them, what's been going on with the core of the meta? Well, it looks like it's finally getting optimized. While we haven't seen as much experimentation in the West, Japan was using quite a bit of Junior, as Squeezer is more popular there for the midline combo, meaning they were fighting a decent bit of double Zuka, which gave Junior a lot of success. After Junior though, a new weapon started seeing use, one that would start to become more popular in both scenes, the Neo Splash-O-Matic. Obviously it's good into Junior or Bubble in general with its high strike output, but Neo Splash is getting popular more because the meta is starting to get optimized. Let's take a look at the short range shooter role that's been common right now. Typically we see stuff like Shot and Splash-O-Matic. How would Neo Splash-O-Matic have an edge over both of those? It doesn't seem like it does too much better than them, and that's because it doesn't. Neo Splash is a very specialized weapon. The main thing it's good at is just paint output. Strikes are a special it builds quickly, especially since it's 10 points for special buff, refills its ink tank, and paint a large amount themselves with no cooldown, meaning paired with a high painting bomb and main weapon, Neo Splash is going to output more turf compared to any other weapon filling this role. This is working out well because short range weapons have struggled fighting a lot more in this meta. Unless if you're a 52, most short range weapons have been shifting to being played more and more supportively, so it only makes sense that the most support heavy short range shooter is the one that's seeing a lot more popularity. The other thing this is benefiting is Pencil. I think a lot of people see Pencil as the main painting and supportive weapon, and while Pencil does output a lot of paint, I don't think it's necessarily as supportive as people think it is. Pencil's actually really good as a crossfire or fighting weapon, just from a lot safer of a distance. One shot from Pen is going to combo to a kill from pretty much anything else, which means the most optimal Pencil gameplay is actually pushing the weapon to be more aggressive. But this comes with a lot of risks. The weapon could die more often and might not be contributing as much to paint, which is why this is happening a lot more now that we have a short range shooter that that is covering that. Neosplash isn't going to die a lot, it's going to be fine hanging back and spamming bombs, and it's going to be able to paint the map so well that Pencil isn't going to have to focus on it as much, allowing it to help the mid-range combo. All of this is going to come together to create a comp that's playing a lot more optimally. You have more clearly defined roles and playstyles centered around enabling these strong double midline weapons. And this is what we've seen in the most recent Area Cup. The main meta comp right now of Neosplash, Slosher, Squeezer, and Pencil winning the tournament. Wait a second here. If we have more clearly defined roles and passive weapons that struggle at being rushed down, what about rushdown comps to counter that? I mean, this is what people did during Crab meta, right? You ran stuff like Junior because you'll need a bubble and paint and a beacon to be able to get your teammates back in, run mostly short range dive weapons, pick stuff like Tetra and Wiper, and just run it down and break the formation that the other comp is so dependent on. And the answer is, well, that is exactly what's being tried. The comp that got third place in this tournament, losing to the winning team, was pretty much going for that. A coolerless comp with stuff like Wiper, Mini, Dapple, and Edit Splatling. And in Grand Finals, while it wasn't a full rushdown comp, we also saw Tetra Dualies, which is the main weapon people know for this comp. Now that there are more clearly defined roles and team formations in this meta, it makes it easier to run something to try to counter it, because now you have a clearly defined comp you're going against. So stuff that can just run it down and not have to deal with being as organized could potentially work against it. However, it's a very risky strategy. You're not going to have a lot of entry tools since you're running a lot of specials that help get kills, and you're oftentimes not going to have Cooler, since if you're rushing down the whole time, having to slow down or be clumped up to grab Cooler isn't what you want, and Coolerless is really risky. But that's kind of what happens at this point, and until these counter strats get developed more, we're not going to know if they're going to work or not. In Crab meta, people might have tried it for a while, but eventually it didn't really work out, and that could be the same case here. We don't quite know yet. The other thing that could happen is even if these strats do work, it could just mean that the meta comp has to change their weapons a little bit more, which could have the positive of having more weapons being picked, but could also make the meta a little bit too counter pick heavy and force people off other options. We could also just see smaller changes to the meta though. Something like custom well string is pretty interesting more recently, having a niche of being incredibly good at shredding wall while providing similar chip damage to Explosher with a little bit more emphasis on location. This is something you could slot in with more aggressive comps like we saw in Area Cup, or could run alongside a more standard comp by using Zap as your short range shooter and pairing it with a classic double midline like Range Bucket, Bucket Stamper, or Range Stamper, which would all work well with the weapon. And of course there could also be an attempt to run something like Dowser Dualies and run a backless composition. This was something really common in Splatoon 2, where people would run 4 weapons that could kind of fight whenever and be really mobile and flexible, but that hasn't been as common in Splatoon 3 with the different weapons and kits we have in this game. In my opinion, while there's a lot of interesting counterplay options on the table, I think the Pencil double midline comp is here to stay. It's just been good for so long now, and I think despite many different weapons being added that can work well against it, this style of play has just clearly proven itself over the past year or so, and players are only going to get better at it. And while Western teams lean a bit more fight heavy with stuff like 52 and V-Shot being used in the most recent Super Jump, the core ideas are largely the same, and Neosplash is still gaining popularity here. The only thing that might change it is the upcoming nerfs in the next patch, but we'll have to see what happens then. What do you guys think of the recent developments of this meta? Do you enjoy the spot we're currently in, and what do you want to see changed? I'll see you all next time.